Today, we're diving into the story of a band that didn't just write songs, they basically rewrote the rulebook for music and culture. Yep, we're talking about the Beatles. I mean, just think about it. How did four guys from one city in England become the most famous band in the history of the world? It's a huge question, and today, we're going to try to answer it. All right, so every huge story has a beginning, right? And for the Beatles, it all started in this industrial port city called Liverpool. This is where they really cut their teeth, sharpened their skills, and, crucially, met the people who would help launch them into the stratosphere. Now, you might think they started out as a rock and roll band, but nope, their roots are actually in something called skiffle. It was a super popular, kind of do-it-yourself music style in Britain back in the 50s. Imagine a mix of folk and blues, but with a rock and roll energy, often played on whatever instruments you could find. It was the perfect starting point for young John Lennon, who kicked things off with their first band, the Quarrymen. And let's be clear, this was no overnight success story, not even close. These guys spent years grinding it out, playing these super long, exhausting shows in clubs in Hamburg, Germany. That's what really turned them into a powerhouse band. And it was right around this time that two super important people came into their lives: their manager, Brian Epstein, and their producer, George Martin. So, Brian Epstein, this guy was a visionary. He saw their raw talent, but he also knew they needed a major image overhaul to hit the big time. He's the one who famously convinced them to trade in their tough leather jackets for those iconic sharp suits. And this wasn't just about looking good. It was about transforming them from a rowdy local band into a worldwide sensation. And if Epstein handled the image, George Martin was the genius behind the sound. He's often called the fifth Beatle, and for good reason. His background was in classical music, and that was the secret sauce. He could take their amazing, raw song ideas and turn them into these incredibly polished productions. I'm talking about adding string quartets and fancy piano solos, stuff that was just unheard of in pop music back then. Okay, so you've got this slick new look, you've got this totally groundbreaking sound. The stage was set for an absolute explosion. And what happened next? Well, it was a level of fame the world had literally never seen before. Millions. Just look at that number. Millions of people watched their very first performance on American TV on The Ed Sullivan Show. It wasn't just a TV show, it was a cultural earthquake. That one night blew the doors wide open for them in the US and kicked off a total phenomenon. And that phenomenon, of course, got its own name: Beatlemania. This was way more than just having fans. This was hysteria. Everywhere they went, just massive, screaming crowds. The noise was so insane that it actually created a huge, unexpected problem for the band. And their arrival in America wasn't just a one-off. It was the start of what we now call the British invasion. Because they were so huge, they basically paved the way for a whole wave of other bands from the UK to come over and find success. They kicked the door down, and everyone else followed. Just try to imagine this. You're on stage in a giant stadium playing your heart out, but the screams are so loud you literally can't hear your own guitar. That's what the Beatles were dealing with every single night. The sound systems back in the 60s just couldn't handle the sheer volume of the fans. It got so frustrating that they made a pretty radical decision in 1966. They just stopped touring, for good. So what does the biggest band in the world do when they can't play live anymore? They locked themselves away in the one place where they had total control over the sound, the recording studio. And honestly, this is where they changed music forever. Yeah, once they were off the road, the studio became their playground. It was incredible. They'd start with a basic track, guitar, bass, drums. But then, using new multi-track recorders, they could just layer on new sounds, one by one. They experimented with wild tape effects, brought in strange instruments like string quartets, or even used random sounds like an alarm clock. They were literally building their songs piece by piece like architects. One of their go-to tricks was something called backmasking. The idea is simple. You record a sound, and then you just play it backward. But the result? It created these bizarre, otherworldly sounds that nobody had ever heard before. It was a huge part of their new kind of psychedelic vibe. And this whole period marked a really important change for them. They went from being a pop band that churned out hits to being seen as true artists. They were creating these complicated, amazing pieces of music that you could never ever play live on a stage. They proved that a pop album could be a serious work of art. But their influence went way beyond just the music. The Beatles became a symbol for all the massive changes happening in the 1960s. Yeah, they influenced pretty much everything. Fashion? Check. Those mop-top haircuts were everywhere, and later their psychedelic clothes defined the look of the era. They also got a whole generation of Westerners interested in things like Eastern philosophy and meditation. And in the music industry, they were the ones who made the album the main event, not just the single. They basically showed everyone that pop musicians could be a force for change and challenge tradition. And at the core of all this genius was the legendary songwriting partnership of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. They were so different. John could be sharp and brutally honest, while Paul was a master of melody. But that friendly competition just pushed them to be better and better, creating this catalog of songs that is just untouchable. But, all great things come to an end. The pressure of being the Beatles, that intense fame, the creative differences, it all started to build up. In those last few years, the cracks really started to show. They started their own company, Apple Corps, which just added a bunch of business stress to the mix. Their very last public performance was this iconic surprise concert on a rooftop in London. And then, a year later, in 1970, Paul McCartney made it official. The band was over. It was a huge deal, like the end of an era. But here's the thing. The end of the band was nowhere near the end of their story. Billions. That's how many records they've sold. Billions, with a B. They are still, to this day, the best-selling music act of all time. Their music is just timeless. So it brings us back to that first question. What does it actually take to change the world with music? The story of the Beatles gives us a pretty good recipe, right? You need raw talent, for sure, but also insane hard work, a genius team behind you, and the guts to just completely break all the rules. They were so much more than a band. They were a cultural force that showed the world that four guys with guitars could actually, truly change everything.